Welcome to the NFCP March Sanctions Update. I'm Louis Vargas, the founder of the Network for Financial Crime Prevention, your community for financial crime compliance professionals. Today, we have an outstanding panel joining us to break down the latest developments in the sanctions landscape. We're joined by Ian Bolton of Sanctions SOS, Mark Handley of Duane Morris, Aleksi Pursiainen of Solid Plan Consulting, and Dara Fernandez of Cina Fernandez. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. What you hear today is for informational purposes only, and should not be taken as legal advice. If you want to learn more about NFCP, please visit us at our website, which is nfcp.info, and our LinkedIn page. We will try something new today. Each pundit will have a maximum of 5 minutes to provide an update on their assigned region. I will stop them if time is exceeded, and we'll move on to the next pundit or region. I will then ask the panel a couple of questions on a specific topic for a roundtable chat. We'll try to leave questions at the end. Save time for some Q&A at the end for our audience. There's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. I forgot to start the recording during the live session, so you'll start as it has begun. It's already in progress. So I hope you enjoy.
So obviously we've had the start of the year with the Venezuela issues, and I won't go into, but in terms of the knock-on effect, we saw sort of the UK collaborating on various issues, providing permission to board in regard to a couple of seizures, maritime seizures. But they were very quick to say that there wouldn't be any major changes in the Venezuela sanctions regime that the UK has, that they would be waiting to see what would happen in terms of the sort of the successive regime to Maduro's regime, whether there would be any actual real change, and they would wait to make any movements on that. We've seen obviously continuation of the Russia sanctions regimes, sort of more designations, more sort of going after sort of the dark fleet, but also widening things out. So more oil and gas related measures. Again, we've sort of seen interesting dynamics in terms of, once again, the sort of the anniversary was made a big deal out of, even though potentially they already had those designations ready to go, which is a bit of, has become this odd set piece every year, right, where we have to do something on the anniversary of the invasion, even though actually if they're worthy of being designated, then in theory they should just be designated. The UK was in theory trying to make a focus point on Sudan this year. That was going to be their sort of focus area. They have taken over the UN Security Council presidency, and that's what they wanted to really focus on. Obviously, events in the Middle East have overtaken those, and so Sudan has fallen by the wayside a little bit again. I mean, in terms of enforcement actions, we've not seen a huge, as ever. We sort of still await this like forever dam to burst with the enforcement agencies in the UK. So we've seen bits and bobs, which I think is fair. I will probably let Mark speak more to the ins and outs of the enforcement action as he follows it more closely. But we're still waiting on this sort of big drive, big change. We've seen some logistical changes. So we now have one UK sanctions list where we previously had two UK sanctions lists. So the HMT consolidated list is no more. We just have one sanctions list where you will find everyone who is designated both for the purposes of asset freezes and travel bans. And there was a lot around sort of making sure people were aware of the changeover, making sure that systems could cope with that. It seems to have all gone relatively smoothly, which I mean is not, is a pretty significant thing for the UK when it comes to this type of stuff, because it doesn't always go that smoothly. So we'll take that win. And then they've commissioned a couple of other areas of where they're looking for sort of feedback and views on sort of the broader picture in terms of OFSI, in terms of the enforcement powers that they have and how they use them, and what all of that looks like. So things to be aware of. There's clearly a lot of sort of internal looking at what the sort of structure should be looking like going forward. We're still sort of in this watching space, I guess, to see about enforcement action.
Cool. Thank you very much. Right, with a minute to spare. Awesome. So I guess dovetailing nicely, since you mentioned Mark, we'll hand over the mic to you to give an update on the EU and enforcement actions.
There we go. I don't know if anyone else sat through the evidence that was given to Parliament by the Secretary of State and HMRC and OFSI, but I had to stop myself from laughing when the Secretary of State said that the UK was the best enforcer in Europe when it came to sanctions and export controls. I mean, just yeah, we'll see. We'll see. That's not my impression, but there we go. So turning to the EU, obviously the 20th package scheduled for the anniversary didn't happen. There were lots of little complications with the proposals that the likes of Malta and Greece and Italy and France were raising, but the big objections were Hungary and Slovakia, largely unrelated to the contents of the 20th package and all related to energy security in those countries and the delivery of oil through the Druzhba pipeline. So I think there will be a 20th package. Obviously, it's still pretty thin as to exactly what it will include or the detail. There's said to be a replacement of the oil price cap in line with to be switched out for a maritime services ban. Similar maritime services ban for LNG. Exactly what that means is unclear. Lots of more ship designations were proposed, and also sanctions of some sort, whether a transaction ban or an asset freeze is unclear, on foreign ports that were handling a lot of Russian shipping. Although the Italians were unhappy with a particular port in Georgia being included, and other countries, other member states were unhappy with a particular port in Indonesia being included. So we'll see exactly which foreign ports get included. In terms of maritime enforcement, some of which I'll leave to Aleksi and what's been going on in the Nordics, but elsewhere, I mean, just this weekend, the Belgian Navy, in a joint operation with the French, seized a sanctioned vessel in the North Sea on Saturday night. France, obviously, famously arrested the Grinch just to ruin Christmas in January, was taken to southern France, and the company that owned the Grinch oil tanker, dark fleet oil tanker, was fined millions. We don't know how much, but then the vessel was released, cargo intact. So, a little toll was excised by the French, and they'll still make an absolute fortune with the cargo. The French had, in September last year, done a similar seizure of a tanker in the Atlantic, and the trial of the captain of that vessel started on Monday in France. He's being tried in absentia. He's a Chinese national. He was released at the time of the arrest of the vessel, and they have not got him back, but the trial is going ahead in his absence anyway. Italy in January also seized a vessel, not an oil tanker. It was a vessel that arrived in Brindisi with a cargo of Russian steel. And so the cargo and the vessel have been impounded. And so we are seeing more of and leaving out the Nordics and the Baltics for now, we are seeing more of an emphasis on that kind of maritime enforcement than previously. And as a stepping stone towards that, both the Irish and the Belgians have announced planned changes to their law to make it easier for their respective navies to seize vessels where there may be sanctions issues or false flag issues. The Irish want that law to be in place by the time they take on the EU presidency in the summer. And Belgium, I mean, they don't seem to have any lack of powers because they've already done it. But the Belgians are also proposing to be able to more readily seize vessels where there are false flag issues. So watch this space, and be interesting to see whether other member states follow that as well.
Cool. Thank you very much, Mark. A few seconds before time, so thank you for that. Doing well to get today with the timing. And since you mentioned Aleksi a lot and the Nordics, I'll hand over the mic to Aleksi.
Yeah, just putting my timer on. I don't want to lose to the others on punctuality. So A couple of things, maybe to build on Mark's excellent summary on the vessel issues, and thanks also for pointing me out to a couple of interesting developments here in the north. I think, don't have much time, but I think one of the interesting issues from a Finnish Nordic perspective in relation to these seizures and onboarding of vessels is the sort of international law background and limitations placed on that, which doesn't seem to be that much present in the US approach. We had already last year a case, the famous Eagle S case here in Finland, where they identified a vessel on the exclusive economic zone between Finland and Estonia and damaging cables there. The Finnish district court in October ruled that they in fact lacked jurisdiction over the activities of that vessel related to a couple of law of the sea points, but mainly because of the fact that the prosecutors had not sought to assert that the damage done to the cables at the bottom of the sea was intentional, but instead was due to recklessness of the crew. And there the court then said, well, if you say that, then it is in fact not an intentional act that we might have some jurisdiction over, but what's known in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as an incident of navigation, which then meant that only the country that has the ship flag is allowed to exercise jurisdiction, which surprisingly then is not the country that is interested in exercising that jurisdiction. We also had, and thanks to Mark for pointing this out, the Adler case in Sweden, where they had a Russian ship temporarily lay anchor on what I understood to be in fact the territorial waters of Sweden, and the vessel was sanctioned, and there was indications that they might be carrying weapons destined to Russia, but there then the prosecutor again had read their UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, at least to some extent, and then said that because the vessel said that they were in territorial waters exclusively because they had engine failure, and then that was a valid claim for their presence there being protected by the right of innocent passage. That then the prosecutor said that they failed to have they didn't have jurisdiction because of the sanctions concern to do anything much about it. They had to leave it. They had to let it go. And similarly, I think in one of the cases where there was two other cases, one in Estonia, one in Denmark, also anchored, pun intended, to the international law framework. In both instances, then there appeared to be a false flag or a lack of registration in both cases, and that then would appear to be, even in the Nordic perception, adequate to then say that jurisdiction may exist because of the fact that the law of the sea only grants these particular rights not directly on any ship, but to other states. So if you're not registered in a particular state, or you claim to be registered in several, which is not allowed, then you lack the protections given by the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, and you may then impose your national jurisdiction here. But again, even though many states around here are seeking to make sure that they have maximum jurisdiction over shadow fleet vessels as allowed by international law, there are limitations to what those countries that still have respect for international law may lawfully wish to do under their domestic rules. Still, obviously, a very worthwhile pursuit to make sure that, for instance, the issues in Finland, I'm not sure, maybe clear regulations might have helped to some extent, as in Sweden. But that's on the vessels. I still have 33 seconds, so just a quick update on other things going on. We had a Finnish Supreme Court case, I think the second or third, related to sanctions. The only thing that I have time to bring up from that was that it is the only case I know of at this level that refers to the European Commission's FAQ on Russia sanctions, and they say that a claim by an individual that they did not know that carrying cash to Russia was allowed only for personal expenses during the trip. The court said that, well, you can't claim this because if you had read the Commission FAQ at that time, it said that it was only for that purpose, and then referred to the later European Court of Justice case, which had confirmed this, but after the fact. So, yay, European Commission FAQ is a source of soft law in the Finnish legal system. Thank you.
Thanks, Aleksi. a little over time, but it was okay since Mark and Ian came in early.
Oh, we
And,
can trade our time, can we?
yeah,
Okay.
this is we're playing loose and fast since this is a new format. And we'll round off the updates with Dara going over the US.
And I will gladly take on any time you guys did not use. So, I mean, I think where to start on the US roundup. So if we look at, I'd like to just make a couple statements on what 2025 was like. So 2025 saw, in addition to just huge geopolitical dynamism, we saw more enforcement actions than the year prior. We saw, I mean, the total penalties went from, I think, 49 million in 2024 to 265 million in 2025. So that is a huge increase in the total value of penalties. Some of those penalties give us some really interesting policy indications, but 8 out of the 14 that were released in 25 were associated to Russia. So it was very Russia-centric for enforcement in the US. We did have about 870 total Iranian designations. So that is a huge increase in designations for Iran. We obviously came up with a 10-year new record-keeping requirement. And the reason why I'm saying these is because why I'm highlighting these key items is because those have a real impact on the day-to-day compliance protocols for almost every industry, right? Like going from the 5-year statute of limitation in record-keeping requirement to the 10-year is a massive shift that not every compliance department is going to be prepared to undertake. And then obviously we have the IEPA decision at the Supreme Court that, TBD what it actually will mean, but nonetheless, it was part of the 2025 turmoil. We also had non-traditional target designations like allied judiciary members in Brazil, ICC personnel, which is something we had never seen before. We had the designation of a sitting allied head of state in Colombia. Like 2025 was giving us an indication that 2026 was going to be really dynamic, for lack of a better word. I know that we're recording this session. So having talked about 25, I think for 26, we've seen, I don't know where to start on 2026, but maybe we start with Venezuela as kind of like a recent event. What I think are going to be key things key themes for 2026 is the extreme volatility of the regime and the relatively knee-jerk reaction that we're going to all have to have as compliance professionals and people involved in the national security policy world is our ability to be very agile as things change. I think a great example, Syria was a bit more of a lockstep situation between EU, US, UK, even though it came in different stages. It seemed like the walk was a similar path. We obviously haven't seen that when it comes to Russia, Venezuela, and obviously now the most recent geopolitical conflict in Iran. So on Venezuela, what we've learned is that all you can do is constant monitoring. And what is prohibited today may be allowed tomorrow. And we thought that this was the way that he would deal with Venezuela post-capture of Maduro, would be through the issuance of general licenses. And you can see there's just such a slew of general licenses that have been issued at speed. So I think a key theme for 2026 is going to be keeping constant monitoring eye on Venezuela. I don't need to say it, Iran being at peak levels of risk and how that impacts, putting aside the personal impact, because I think that it's always easy to forget when we're working in this space what this is really about. And this is about human life and human rights. And this is about impacting real people in real places. So putting aside your potential personal impact of any of these conflicts, I think Iran being at a peak level has a huge impact on supply chain, is going to have a huge impact on economy. I don't believe that any of us actually know what that is going to be, because Saturday Night Live might be the best predictor of what's going to happen, but there is a great sense of uncertainty on what will this actually mean beyond the actual conflict. So we have Venezuela, we have Iran, we have now an inclination on these non-traditional targets, right? So where ICC judges would have never had to fear being designated, now you have ICC judges being personally designated. What does that mean for 2026 to anybody that disagrees? And I think that those non-traditional targets are another key theme to watch for 26. I also think that we have seen more individual liability expanding, and that is very critical and very important, because the traditional enforcement trend has been on corporate liability, and now we're seeing more and bigger enforcement actions against individuals. We had 3 out of the 14 were actually targeting individuals, which is a pretty high number. We then have the expansion of secondary sanctions, and I think we're seeing no fear to use secondary sanctions whenever the regime allows it. And that is, again, the reason why this is so important is because of how it impacts our supply chain, both on the inbound service providers as well as our outbound, wherever you may be on the supply chain, knowing that secondary sanction powers are being utilized for purposes of Russia and Iran creates a really big gap and a really big question mark on most people's supply chain risk management. Yeah. And then I think the Russia divergence risk is another critical one for 2026, and we will continue to see it, where we thought Lukoil, Rosneft were not necessarily going to be designated by the US, and they were designated by the US, but you can see the difference in designation, for example, on cases like Nayara, which is designated under the EU, the Swiss, and the UK, but not under the US, that has a huge implication for compliance programs all around. So I do think that the divergence in Russia, Iran, Venezuela is going to have huge impact. And I don't think that the first quarter of 2026 is just a preview of the rest of 2026. I don't think anything will change drastically to take us back to where we were in 2024. I don't know how many minutes I've taken.
You're a little over, but that's fine. There's a lot to say there. Thank you for that, Dara. But I if I'm not mistaken, I think during Trump's first administration, he also targeted ICC judges. So I think it's unprecedented, but I think it's something that's in Trump's toolkit. But yeah, a lot to keep in mind, especially with the, administration being so, it's like the Wild West when it comes to the Trump administration. Yeah, exactly. Cool. So thank you for that. For the quick roundtable on the main jurisdictions, and now we'll kind of go into some topic questions. So the first one I want to talk about is maritime. I know some of you already touched on that. I guess just to start things off, I remember when my compliance career started back in 2013, 2014. That's when vessels started to be sanctioned, and people really didn't know what to do with it. Even I would say probably until the Russia invasion of Ukraine, I think still people weren't fully, on board with how to really look at maritime risk. So I'm just curious, and again, not picking on anybody specifically, whoever wants to talk on this, but with the increased pressure on the maritime industry to get this right on what's being sanctioned, how do you see that continuing to evolve as we go forward? Because it seems like this is a tool that's increasingly being used. And smiling. Yeah, go for it, Mark.
Taking the UK as an example, when the UK specifies a ship, there's actually very little consequence that flows from that. It means that it can be told to stay in port. It means it can be told to come into port, and that's about it. There's no prohibition on buying or selling cargo through a specified ship. There's no prohibition on operating a specified ship. There's no, we think of a ship being listed as having enormous consequences, but it doesn't really, at least in the UK rules. Although having said that, some of the recent UK designations have listed as part of the grounds for why someone was designated as they were doing business with a specified ship. Now, that's not actually a designation criteria under the UK sanctions. A little bit cheeky for the British government to be doing that. And the UK government came out in the press a month or two ago saying, they think they have the legal powers to seize vessels in international waters. And they do under the Russian regulations, but only with the consent of the flag state of the vessel, which is perhaps unlikely to be given readily. It's not something they can just do on their own. And a bit like what Dara was saying, where you've got the overlap between the different regimes, if you've got a vessel carrying Venezuelan oil that's designated under the Russian sanctions, the powers that the UK government have are limited to enforcement of the Russian regulation, if it's specified under the Russian regulation. So if it's carrying Iranian oil or Venezuelan oil, the power doesn't exist. So I think the UK can do a better job at specifying a ship more meaningful in terms of having legal consequences, because it's something that they're clearly interested in doing on a policy basis. But it actually has a fairly limited practical effect, or legal, probably has a greater practical effect than a legal effect.
I think on the US, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to give some context. Like I mean, as a person who put in specifying vessels into SAMLA, and as the person who sort of dealt with all of this when it was first coming up at the UN with the things like the Chongchong Gang incident and the Mudu Bong, it is something that we've been seeing as a way of being able to, it essentially is about the vessel. It's not about the stuff that the ship does. That is secondary, and that is something that I think DFT are now looking at, because previously it was just about trying to stop the individual vessels, because it wasn't, we weren't in a position where we had a dark fleet. We had very specific vessels that were linked to the likes of North Korea or to sort of Iranian proliferation networks. But what we weren't trying to do was go after the sort of like Irisal, because they weren't massive at the time, and we weren't going after a dark fleet. And so I think that's the difficulty, is that the specification was around trying to stop a vessel, basically, rather than stop the things that go on around that vessel. Likewise, I think one of the problems that they've had is then, as with a lot of the Russia stuff, they've looked at targeting or dealing with the issues of Russia and not necessarily thinking about how that has ramifications through the rest of sort of SAMLA and the wider sanctions environments. And this is why we've got, for example, no review periods now for any of the sanctions, despite that being argued that it was a Russia issue, because it would create too much of a resource drain because of what was happening with Russia at the time. And it's like, but they're doing this all the time. So again, the stuff that they took to give themselves powers with Russia on vessels was kind of irrelevant anyway, because it was kind of already in SAMLA. But as you say, they've then overcomplicated it, because by doing it in that way, they've now made it so that it only applies to that one regime rather than all of the others. The issue around the flag stuff, I mean, it's interesting. So basically, there are numerous ways under UNCLOS that a vessel could be detained in international waters, even potentially without flagship state consent, depending on the condition of the vessel, etc. And I think that's probably the sort of point where they should be going at it, because they are signatories to UNCLOS. And that's one of the big differences between the UK and the US, is the US is not signatory to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I can remember getting into some interesting arguments around all of this, because we had people who wanted to be able to just interdict vessels wherever they were in the world. And I was kind of like, well, that's a bit like piracy without a proper reason. They're like, but the US can do it. It's like, yes, but the US aren't signatories to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's a bit of a difference there. But I think this is the thing. So like we've seen, for example, the vessel that was taken off the coast of the UK earlier in the year with links to Venezuela and Russia. The legal basis of that is literally down to the fact that the ship's in poor state of disrepair, the insurance is unknown, flag status was being changed on a regular basis. Like if there's an environmental issue there, who's responsible? I think one of the biggest issues that I've seen, though, on the back of this is the unintended consequence of going after all of these, which is literally 2-3 years ago, you would have talked about somewhere around 90 to 95% of the world's shipping fleet was insured by P&I Club. Now it's down to about 63%, which then means that you've got a massive percentage now outside of that sort of stable area. And what does that mean in terms of actual payouts? If a ship does go down, who's paying out? Who's responsible for the clear up? And that is a real problem. Sorry. Anyway, I could talk forever and ever on this stuff.
Dara, you wanted to make
There's
a
a
point?
Shadow Fleet vessel burning off Malta at the moment.
I just wanted to mention that again is a bit of that divergence risk on what prohibitions mean, right? Because in the US, the designation of a vessel absolutely, whether it's a vessel or a tail, absolutely has the same restrictions of dealing directly or indirectly as you would with a natural person or an entity. And so when you have a vessel and it's sanctioned under the EU, the UK, and the US, your restrictions are in law, Mark, like to your point, they're different, right? The prohibitions are different, but in practice, you end up having to take an approach that is that considers all three at the same time, which is to the detriment of sometimes environmental and human safety, right? That was the only point I wanted to make, that from a US perspective, a designation of a vessel has the same effect as if an individual, because we operate on maximum pressure. That's how we like to roll.
But it also makes more sense, right? Because it gives clarity. I think that's the thing. Like this current system that the sort of EU UK is operating, there is ambiguity over exactly what is prohibited around the vessel, other than the vessel itself. And it's like, but that's ridiculous, because when you consider all of the moving parts that go alongside a vessel, I mean, it's huge.
Yeah. And I mean, as far as, UK, EU, as you mentioned, there's a disconnect between the way the US looks at it. Do you think that there's a push internally to kind of move toward more of the US approach, where it's kind of this blanketed approach, or there's still some reluctance to going that route?
I think it really depends on the size of your company and where your company operates and who you bank with and what your banks tell you to do. So I think there's a number of things. In my view, having worked for multinationals, usually the push was always towards, granted, I was in American multinational companies, but I've also been in UK headquartered multinationals. And the approach sometimes is not just what you want, but what your banks kind of tell you that you need to have, because they're not prepared to entertain transactions that are outside their risk appetite. So I do think that it's naturally gearing towards that whatever's the most stringent. And I don't say just US, because to the extent you have an EU requirement that is more stringent, you might way. So I think the move, and I don't know what the rest of the guys think, but the move is towards the most stringent approach, and then look to see whether or not you can have a deviation that's permissible under law. That would be my.
And I think the proposed dropping of the oil price cap and substituting in a blanket maritime services ban is part of that, Dara. I think that's, whereas before, the system was designed to allow entirely lawful trade in Russian oil below a certain price. And that's going to be gone if the proposed 20th package comes in the way that it was advertised. So that will be a big change. And that goes to what you're talking about, Louis, about sort of ramping up to a sort of more maximalist view than had been the case.
Yeah, and I agree, Dara, depending what company you work for and what, the internal rules is what drives it, right? So it's not all about where your company is domiciled. It's kind of what rules do you follow? And then like you said, you go with the maximum amount, because you don't want to then be seen as negligent.
I think that's
no, go ahead.
Especially when it comes to the maritime side, because a nexus there is so easy to have across so many different areas, because you have insurance, reinsurance, you have
Mhm.
flag state, but you also have sort of all of the moving parts. You have the nationality of the captain of the vessel, you have the charterer, you have the owner, you have, like there are so many moving parts that actually a nexus with a country is pretty easy to end up with one way or another. So if that's going to be the case, and the US is the one that you're worrying about the most, then you're probably going to move towards that, managing that risk profile, right? But again, as Mark said, I mean, from an EU perspective, the moving to the maritime services, I think we're going to see something similar in the UK as well. I know that DFT have been hard at work on bringing forward new, but again, my question is, once again, I feel like in the UK system, it's going to be targeted at the Russia system rather than under Samler. And this is the problem. The appropriate place to add additional measures around what a designated vessel can and can't do, or what you can and can't do around that, is through Samler, because that's the framework, right? And then you can then roll it out to all the other regimes you need to, of which Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, like Russia, or you do it for a Russia SI update and then it applies only to Russia. And it's like, great, but that's not gonna, that is not gonna deal with these issues of, well, where's the oil actually originated from? It's on a Russian dark fleet vessel, great, but it's Venezuelan oil, or it's on a Venezuelan ship and it's a Russian oil, but who knows where it's actually from, because they're all gonna claim different things.
Yeah, the vessel that Aleksi mentioned that the Danes have seized, sanctioned by Ukraine for Russian trade and sanctioned by the US for Iran trade, same vessel. And so it kind of goes to your point that, I think a little bit more stepping back, holistic view of how we deal with these ships is necessary for governments.
Yeah.
And I think what's apparent is that once the governments can wrap their heads around this a bit better, then it'll be a bit easier to put it into practice instead of these kind of, guessing games that we have to play. Cool. And I guess dovetailing into that, based on the general maritime topic, is, can we do anything to stop the dark fleet? Anybody want to take that?
Totally stop it, or just make it more difficult? Because
However you want to answer the question.
I think, at the end, this is more of a financial crime comment than a sanctions comment, but where there, where one door closes, a small window opens, and when that one closes, another one opens. And so I think that the sophistication of dark fleet, we could do all we can to make it more difficult, and that's already moving us forward. But whether or not you can totally stop it, I think that's a really hard, I think it would be really difficult to say, yes, you can, because then the level of controls that you would need to make sure that that's happening is far beyond the level of sophistication that every company has, right, to make that a reality. So that's my 2 cents. But
Yeah, I guess more so I was thinking about it from the governmental level than the actual company level. Yeah, it's too much to put on the companies. We're already doing a ton. But sorry.
But I think it's also the fact that, like, it's a dark fleet for the West. It's not dark fleet for the rest of the world. Like, I mean, it acts like it's acting like a dark fleet. Yeah, it's switching off AIS. Very literally, it's a dark fleet, fine. But if you're South Africa, South Africa buying Russian oil, what's it got to do? And this is, I think, part of the wider problem is that in a way, we're kind of trying to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And what we're doing is pushing, for example, the insurance issue, right? And it's like, surely actually having world shipping under insurance, which will pay out if there is a problem, is far more important than whether, because at the end of the day, this oil's still going to flow. And that's the reality. It's like, we can do all we want, but the oil's still flowing to India, oil's still flowing to China. It doesn't even need to go on a blinking vessel to get to some of these, so we're kind of creating bigger problems without actually tackling the real issues. And things like, for example, the Russian steel that you mentioned, like that, or arms, or like, let's focus on what fundamentally, I think that we're just gonna push this issue into other areas if we keep going after it, because I don't think that it's within our, I mean, even in terms of the ships that you're looking at, you still got, I mean, I want to be a bit cautious, but you still got the likes of people in Cyprus and Greece quite happily providing ships, etc., you know, which is an EU country, to the Dutch, because that's what they do. That's their maritime trade. So like, if we can't get even sort of those
But that's what the system was designed to allow. That's what the oil price cap allows. It allows lawful
Right.
trade below a certain price. They weren't even breaking the law.
No. I mean, I think this is fundamentally an issue of the oil price cap has created something which, I mean, I don't, to my, I fundamentally kind of disagree with the oil price cap anyway, because it kind of felt like we were trying to tell the world what they should be doing, and we don't really get to do that. And I think, unfortunately, we've created additional problems through it. And the dark fleet is one of those problems, not necessarily because it's a dark fleet in terms of sanctions busting, but because of everything else that it brings with it as well.
Right. Good point.
Sorry, it's massively
No.
pessimistic. But
No,
but
I like
therefore, but I think from a company perspective, it's about managing our own risks, right? From a government perspective, they've got to figure out what they need to do with all of this, because there is no strategic thinking around this as far as I can see.
Right.
And that's the problem.
And, you know, you bring up strategic planning and thinking. That makes me think of the next question. So I've heard a lot of rumblings and grumblings about the 19th package that wasn't really necessary. And now we have the 20th package being delayed. You know, a lot of people thinking is just, you know, something to do on the anniversary. Is it going to really bring, you know, significant improvements or change that they expect out of Russia? Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to be approved, but from what you're hearing about the 20th package, is it going to be significant? Or we're going to see some additional pressure, or is it just going to be more of the same?
The two things that I think are significant if they end up being included are the change to a maritime services ban and dropping the oil price cap. And the other is finally populating, what is it, Annex 22 or whatever it is, the empty annex, which was there for listing certain products that can't be sold by anyone to certain countries. It hasn't been used. It's been there since summer of 2023. And the plan is to put Kyrgyzstan in that annex and certain products. The two products, one of them was radios that was mentioned by von der Leyen. I'm not quite sure why radios to Kyrgyzstan is going to move the dial on the war, but there we go. But I think once that dam is broken, it then becomes a lot easier to add other countries and other products into that annex, where, you know, whether they go as far as saying, you know, we won't sell, you know, ball bearings to Armenia, to give a hypothetical example, or chemicals that can be used for gunpowder we won't ship to Turkmenistan. But I think once that they start populating that annex, it will only grow, and I think that has the potential to become quite an effective way of stopping EU products getting to Russia.
Just to say something, I'll understand Mark's point about, I think, both the fact that the third country restrictions, both that at the level that we are now thinking about, unlikely to have a big impact, but the principled effect has some potential. For me, I think I'm not really sure whether in terms of individual sort of products and diversion routes, whether adding computer numeric control machines or any particular product and then Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan or whatever as a like a standalone measure would really do that much to block the route of transfer. Because if you prohibit to Kyrgyzstan, then it's to add one country or one intermediary, and it's more costly, all that, and it has an impact through that. But to have a massive impact, I think the way it could have an impact if the EU were to be in the position and be strong enough to use it also to pressure the governments of these third countries. So go to Kyrgyzstan, go to Kazakhstan and say, look, now we've opened the flood doors, and if you don't significantly work with us in contributing to diversion of EU goods to Russia, then we've shown you that we're not afraid to use this, and we'll target something that hurts. And I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but if it were even the possibility of that, I agree with Mark that it may have, for sure, from the selection of tools in the 20th package, that has the potential of being the powerful one.
Awesome. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, or 9 minutes left. So we still have a few people in our audience. I just wanted to open it up to some Q&A. If there's any questions from the audience, this will be the time to either raise your hand or just go off mute and you could ask us.
You say we still have some members, as it is per an inevitability that during the presentation we're bound to lose them all finally.
I didn't mean that negatively. Sorry, Aleksi.
No worries.
Okay, looks like everybody's quiet.
Just to fill a, so we don't have dead air, as it were. Not that we're a radio station. There have, in the last month or two, there have been some examples of non-traditional enforcing states doing things with tankers. So this was the beginning of February. Malaysia, there were 2 tankers doing a ship-to-ship transfer in Malaysian waters for reasons related to sanctions, no doubt, but the actual powers used were relation to maritime safety and so on, and ship-to-ship transfers. And they actually seized the entire cargo, $129 million worth of oil seized. That would be the biggest sanctions fine ever. And Malaysia did it to not much fanfare in February. And there was a similar tanker seizure off in Indian waters a few weeks ago as well. So I think the diplomatic efforts that are obviously the likes of David O'Sullivan and others are doing is having an effect beyond, pure, sanctions enforcement. But I think you're starting to see other countries wake up to what powers they have under things like UNCLOS in relation to ship safety and so on.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
It's always, in the world of interdictions, it was always kind of, you found whatever law you needed to try and stop a shipment moving on, whatever it was. And I think that's the same when it came to like seizing sort of goods, etc. And more often than not, you would approach things from a customs perspective rather than a sanctions perspective, because you have more laws and rules around customs, for example. So I think it's about, like you say, Mark, using what you've got in your toolkit in a effective way as possible. But it is definitely an interesting one. It's a fascinating world. Oh, Louis, we've lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, you've gone again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what's going on. The sanctions landscape is going to remain dynamic for the foreseeable future. I think that's one thing we could all agree on. And now it's just buckling up to see in what ways and how it's going to reshape the world and how we do things, and how, as Dara, you mentioned, and Ian mentioned, how, I guess all of you have mentioned, how companies have to reshape themselves or configure themselves in order to comply in a timely manner, because there's no long ignorance is bliss is no longer an excuse. And recent enforcement actions on companies are proving that point, that you can't just say you didn't know, because it's going to be flagged that you should have known, because there's enough documentation out there. Yeah. So on that point, that's a wrap for today's NFCP March sanctions update. A huge thank you again to Ian, Mark, Aleksi, and Dara for sharing their time and expertise. This is exactly the kind of insight our community depends on. For more resources, upcoming events, and to connect with NFCP, visit us again at our website, nfcp.info, or on LinkedIn. And if you found today's session valuable, please share it with a colleague in any industry that might find this helpful. And until next time, stay sharp, stay brave, and stay compliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
I think-
Bye.
Is there a question from Patrick though, O'Reilly?
Oh, well, yeah, I only put my hand up. It's not really a question. It was merely a thank you. I'm an NFCP virgin, so I saw this on Louis' LinkedIn, so I thought I'd join and just get some insights. And thank you everybody for that. This has been very insightful and informative. I'm not going to come off camera. It's not because I'm shy. I'm just looking at that picture and thinking, God, I look so much better in that than I do in real life. But thank you so much thank you. I'm actually stood up now saying my name's Patrick and I am a sanctions addict, I guess. But thank you everybody, and I hope to join you for the next one. It's been very helpful, and thank you all.
Right.
Cheers, Patrick.
Patrick.
Cheers, Patrick.
Cheers.
Okay. You
Thank you.
gentlemen. Okay.
Cheers.